A quick introduction of Benjamin Park. He is currently an assistant professor of American history at Sam Houston State University. He has a Bachelor's of English and History from BYU, Master's of Theology and History from the University of Edinburgh, Master's of Political Thought and Intellectual History from the University of Cambridge. Did I get them all right? Okay, he's currently editing a book entitled A Companion to American Religious History. He has previously published another book called American Nationalism, Imagining Union in Age of Revolutions. That was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. He is also currently the co-editor of the Mormon Studies Review. He's on the editorial board of the Journal of Mormon History and Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. And he was also one of the founding editors of the group blog on Mormon history called Juvenile Instructor. And with that, we welcome Benjamin Park and hope you'll enjoy his presentation this evening.
I'll just put it in here. Howdy. If I seem a little frazzled, it's because I'm trying to figure out how to fit a temple stone in my suitcase to get on an airplane. It's truly an honor to be here. As an undergraduate student, I loved coming up to Benchmark. It was kind of a rite of passage for me as I became interested in Mormon history. And so I always dreamed of doing one of these events. So it's a great honor to be here. And in fact, when I met with the publicist team at my press to discuss how to promote the book and where to go, I think they'd attest that the first thing I said is we need to do Benchmark books. And so we prioritized it. And in fact, I was so eager to do it and trying to schedule everything in advance that I think I reached out to Brian about doing it. I think I reached out to him in like September about doing it in February. And he's like, I don't think we've ever had someone this far in advance try to schedule an event. So that just shows my, my excitement. I want to start with an anecdote before I get into the meat of my remarks. 1839, March and April. Mormons are religious refugees who had just arrived on Illinois soil after being kicked out by a state-sanctioned mob in Missouri. Illinois, as I'll be discussing later, is a big rival of Missouri, so they take the Mormons in and they pride themselves on being the kind benefactors. And the city Quincy especially takes in a lot of the Mormons who are fleeing Missouri seeking refuge. Among those who are very welcoming to the Saints in Quincy were both of the political party organizations stationed there, both the Whigs and the Democrats. They do fundraisers, they call for help, they organize shelters. They're very kind to the Mormons for reasons that I'll discuss later, and the Mormons in return are very grateful for this. Eventually, Joe Smith gets out of jail, arrives in Illinois, they move from Quincy and they settle in Nauvoo, and they start thanking Quincy for all the work they had done, except for one person who has a bit of a grudge, and that's Lyman Wight. I hope I don't have any Lyman Wight descendants in here, because otherwise I might have some difficulty. Lyman Wight, known as the Wild Ram of the Mountain, was a tall man, thin, with a glorious beard. And he was one of those people imprisoned with Joseph Smith. And he came out of prison fire hot. He wanted to blame someone. And unlike most Mormons who just blamed Missouri and Governor Boggs, he knew the specific people who were to blame, the Democratic Party. That was the party of Wilburn Boggs, that was the party that dominated Missouri politics, and so he thought it was the Democrats who were to blame, and so he started publishing these essays in the Quincy Whigs newspaper, denouncing the Democrats, saying they're the betrayers of America's principles of liberty, and they should not be trusted in this nation. He writes a series, 3 or 4 editorials in the Quincy Whig newspaper. This worries a lot of the other Mormons, especially because they had just received such a warm embrace from both political parties, including the Democrats, and they don't want to alienate them. One person especially worried was a guy by the name of Robert Thompson, who was one of Joseph Smith's clerks and secretaries and had participated in writing the history of the church. And so Robert Thompson, who has sympathies with the Democratic Party, so he's upset with White about that too, he writes a letter to the First Presidency and says, hey guys, we need to chill out. You need to tell Lyman White to take a step back and stop blaming the Democratic Party. One, because it wasn't the party's fault. And two, we need the Democratic Party's help here in the state if we're going to have things end any better than if they did in Missouri. Joseph Smith agrees. And so Joseph Smith writes a letter to Lyman White asking him to simmer down, to take a chill pill, and he does. And Lyman White, to his credit, writes an editorial published apologizing to the state party of the Democrats in Illinois. But what stood out to me in this exchange was in Thompson's letter to the First Presidency, he closed it with a warning. He said that if we don't learn our lesson from Missouri and stay out of politics, then, quote, in 3 or 4 or 5 years hence, our altars shall be once again thrown down, our homes destroyed, our brethren slain, our wives widowed, and our children orphaned. If we don't stop meddling in political affairs, we are going to have the same thing happen to us in Illinois as we did in Missouri. That's April 1839 that Lyman White is. And at that point, Joseph Smith agrees, and he follows that counsel. And later on, things go a bit different. Spoiler alert. All right, so anecdotal. When I was a BYU student, I'd like to say long ago, but I imagine many of you would chastise me for characterizing that short period as a long time. BYU had a semester away program that they called a semester at Nauvoo. And I was coming back from my LDS mission, and I wanted a good stepping stone back into society because I was not ready for the real world again. So I took this semester at Nauvoo just on a whim. And when I was out in Nauvoo, 2 things happened. One is I fell in love with history. I fell in love with Nauvoo in particular, and the history of Nauvoo. I also just became in love with history, and I changed my major from being a pre-med major to an English and a history major. I decided I still wanted to be a doctor, just one who didn't make money. But the second thing that happened was while I was in Nauvoo, Richard Bushman's Rough Stone Rolling came out. And I witnessed the divided opinion that Rough Stone Rolling caused. At first, there was such excitement that there was a new biography of Joseph Smith that it was even included on the list of potential readings for my church history class. But then 3 weeks into the semester, the teacher got up in front of the class, held up the book, and said, I know I included this book in the potential readings, but I want to tell you that we, this royal we that's never defined, we do not trust this book after reading through it. We feel it is unfair to the Smith family. And that struck me of the politics of history, of how divisive it could be. So I put that in my back pocket. Went back to BYU, finished my degree, and then my interest took me elsewhere. I was interested in politics, in religion, in the period earlier than Mormonism. So I went out, got my PhD, wrote my first book on politics, and I thought I had in the back of my mind this Nauvoo project and the politics of Mormon history. But I thought it'd be much later in my career before I turned back to it. And then in 2016, the church released the Council of 50 Minutes. The minutes that I'm sure many of you know had long been mythologized as the gold treasure of the Mormon tradition. And I, as a, by this point, a self-appointed expert on religion and politics, this was the meat I'd been waiting for. And I dug in, and I was assigned to write a review of it for a journal. And so I reviewed it, and I was just so struck by its contents that I decided, all right, now's the time to tackle Nauvoo. And that was about 4 years ago, and so now Kingdom of Nauvoo is here. A few things about what the book attempts to do. Nauvoo is well known within the LDS tradition. We have the restored Nauvoo, known as a the Mormon Williamsburg to some. People take trips out to Nauvoo. We read about Nauvoo in Sunday school. But I think it's sometimes hard to fathom how unknown Nauvoo is outside the LDS tradition, or outside the Mormon tradition. It's just unheard of. And part of that is because there has not been a general history of Nauvoo written for a non-Mormon audience in over 50 years. And so there's just a paucity of work. So there's just, and I've encountered this as I worked on this project, and now that it's been released a long period of 2 days now, that there's just this thirst, this hunger for learning about this weird episode. Weird in American terms. And so as I approach this work to try to introduce it to an audience who might be unfamiliar with Nauvoo, I also had another audience in mind. The LDS audience, or those who are familiar with Mormonism, and I wanted to make sure there is some new stuff in there too. So to be able to bridge these two audiences, I decided this book was going to focus not only on the story of Nauvoo, and there's a lot of story stuff here, but also on the context and its meanings. What does Nauvoo tell us about the broader America at the time? Because typically histories of Nauvoo follow one of two directions. Within the LDS tradition, it's seen as exceptional, right? God's chosen people separated from the world and establishing their utopia. To critics of the church, or just those outside of the faith, Nauvoo is this crazy place that has no connection to where rational people live. So whichever perspective you look at, Nauvoo is exceptional, quixotic, it's atypical. So one of my primary motives in this book is to show how, yes, a lot of what happens in Nauvoo is radical, it's unique, but it's actually driven by the same anxieties that you'd find throughout 1840s America. And so I wanted to root Nauvoo in its culture, in its time. And I want to highlight a few things of driving questions I had while writing this, and hopefully then you'll have some questions that we can dig into some nitty-gritty. First, politics. What does Nauvoo's political actions, especially its bloc voting habits, tell us about American government? Well, there are two cultural things to keep in mind. On the one hand, this is a period typically known as Jacksonian democracy, named after Andrew Jackson, a president in the 1830s, who shapes American democracy during the time and has two key features. One, local control. Federal authority is absent during this time. It's all about local control. The higher up in the political system you get, the more prone to corruption, they believed. So the purest form of government is at the local level. That's one principle. And the second is the individual conscience. You should be able to have the right to make your own decisions, to choose your own representatives, unfettered by your authority figures. This is seen in the religious context as well. One of the most influential books on early American religion is by Nathan Hatch, titled The Democratization of American Christianity. One of those great books where the whole thesis is in the title. Where basically the argument is that in early America, religions were to erode the authority of those who are ecclesiastical leaders. Right? So those are the two dominant streams. One, local control. Two, individual liberty. The Mormons buck both of those trends. And they do so in interesting ways that reflect how other people are reacting to Jacksonian America. Because many people are starting to worry that this democratization stuff is going too far. It's introducing anarchy. It's disorganization. It's chaos. It's we cannot bring meaning to life when everyone is out doing their own thing. Alexis de Tocqueville, the French aristocratic philosopher who tours America during this same decade, calls this the tyranny of the majority. That as long as a majority of people want something, that is defined as the rule of the land. And so if you are a minority group, if you're on the peripheries of culture, you're just plumb out of luck. And so you see a number of groups trying to retrench, trying to introduce new ways. And that's where the Mormons come in and reflect that anxiety. And the Mormons do this a number of ways, most significantly through bloc voting. which basically worked this way. The saints would decide which leaders would best reflect their interests, and then at a general conference before the elections, Joseph Smith or Hiram or someone else would get up and say, we believe that so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so running for these offices will best defend our rights as Nauvoo. And then on election day, if you lived in Nauvoo, you would march into one of the precincts, one of them being in Hiram Smith's own office, where you would be met by Hiram and Joseph Smith, who were just hanging out in the office. And back then, it wasn't secret ballots. Back then, you would go in and you would vocally declare who you are voting for. And they would have a ledger, and they would write down your name, and then they would mark a tally in the columns of who you voted for. And so, for example, on August 6th or August 1st, 1842, I know you guys are going to stump me on the date if I got that wrong. August 1st, 1842, they march, a number of people march into Hiram Smith's office, 457 to be exact. Of those, all but 17 vote in the same pattern across the 10 different races that they were voting on. Now, they saw this as their way to secure their rights. They were pretty outspoken in defending this method. They said, John Taylor in a newspaper once said, what good would it serve Nauvoo if half of our residents disenfranchise the other half? Meaning half vote for one person, half vote the other person, thereby rendering Nauvoo's vote moot. No, we need to pool our votes together. But you can see how those outside Nauvoo will see this. This is a betrayal of the individual conscience thing. This is the type of backroom dealing of church and state that disestablishment was supposed to disavow. There's a specific political context in Illinois that makes this especially potent. Because when the Saints arrive in the early 1840s, this is a period of massive growth for Illinois. Illinois is getting lots of new people. And three things happen. One, that because of their rise in population, they get 3 new congressional seats. Which means there's going to be 3 new races where all the votes are going to be necessary. 2, the state legislature passes a law that says any white man who resides within this state for at least 6 months is eligible to vote. Which means the thousands of Mormon converts flowing into Nauvoo are suddenly eligible to vote in these important elections. And 3, the 2 parties at the time, the Whigs and Democrats, are almost perfectly evenly split in the state. So you can see what type of recipe this forms. It means that these Mormon votes are important. Now this terrifies those outside of Nauvoo because they see undue influence led by religious leaders. But to saints inside Nauvoo, they're like, finally our voice is going to be listened to. Finally our interests are going to be respected. And so they go off of that. I'm going to skip over some things I was going to say about national power and authority, but if you're interested in Joseph Smith's presidential run and why his arguments for federal power are interesting, ask in the Q&A. All right, because the next question I want to cover, of what I try to address in this book, is a simple one, but one we sometimes overlook when we think about Nauvoo. And it's this. How did a group of citizens near Nauvoo decide that their best course to justice was to form an extra-legal mob and lynch Joseph Smith? Now, in the Mormon setting, that's an easy answer to give, because they're demons, right? We even have that famous book that was a bestseller for a long time, The Fate of the Persecutors of Joseph Smith, right? They were all bad guys and they received their due punishment. But it's a bit harder to actually reconstruct what justified such a radical action. Because that's one thing that struck me in doing the work for this book. The Mormons, it's easy to see, they gave up faith in the democratic system, and that's why they start doing all these radical things like the Council of 50 and bloc voting and others. But those who killed Joseph Smith also gave up on the democratic system. Also decided that the system in place was not strong enough, not viable enough, to bring justice to their community, and therefore they had to do it themselves. So how did they get to that point? And I think it has to do not just with politics, but with law. Specifically, how the Mormons interpreted a legal statute or a legal process known as habeas corpus. Now, a few of you may know this because there's some legal scholars who have written some articles. Habeas corpus basically is when you're arrested for a crime and you can be brought before a judge, and the judge can rule, or a court can rule, on the validity of the arrest when you were arrested by the police force. A habeas corpus hearing has nothing to do with the merits of the case, whether you are innocent or guilty of the charges. It only has to do with whether the arresting authorities followed the law in arresting you. And the Mormons come to see habeas corpus as their bulwark of liberty. And let me explain how. It all has to do with Missouri. At first, Joseph Smith escapes Missouri without much of a fuss out of Missourians, because I'm pretty sure that the Missourians held Joseph Smith in jail as hostage until the rest of the Mormons flee Missouri, and then they let Joseph Smith go as long as they stay out. But as soon as they see Joseph Smith and the Mormons flourishing in Illinois, they have second thoughts. They start having regrets. So in 1840, they have their first requisition order, which is where the governor signs an arrest warrant for Joseph Smith based on his actions in Missouri and says, Illinois, you need to return Joseph Smith for trial. So arrest warrant is out, extradition order is out, Joseph Smith is arrested, but by this point he's gained some political friends. Among them, a short dude by the name of Stephen A. Douglas, who becomes famous later on for the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and is one of the key political thinkers behind popular sovereignty. And Stephen A. Douglas is a political party man to the core. He's all about the Democratic Party. By the age of 27, he's already representative in the state, and he's the face of the Democratic Party. And his big goal is to make the Mormons consistent Democratic voters. And so he, by 1841, is appointed a circuit judge in the state at the ripe old age of 28. And when Joseph Smith is arrested, Stephen A. Douglas says, hey, I am going to try this case. So they bring the case out to Stephen A. Douglas, and he grants him habeas corpus, saying that there are flaws in the arrest warrant, and so therefore Joseph Smith is free. Now granted, that has nothing to do with the charges that Missouri had, just the arrest, but Missouri took a step back, and the Mormons celebrated. So that plants the first seed in Nauvoo's mind that, okay, habeas corpus is something that can help us. Flash forward to the next year, 1842. Lilburn Boggs is shot in his own home. Naturally, lots of people suspect that the Mormons did it. Disregard the fact that Lilburn Boggs had lots of enemies, and we, to this day, have no idea who it was that tried to shoot him. I know there's probably some who want to believe the Orrin Porter Rockwell theory, and I won't disabuse you of that if you want. But as soon as the Lilburn Boggs is shot and he recovers, he signs a warrant saying that he has evidence that Joseph Smith was behind the assassination, that he ordered the hit. And so, and once again, the Illinois governor decides to play ball and signs an extradition order to send Joseph Smith back to Missouri. The arresting officers arrive in Nauvoo, and Nauvoo scrambles for a resistance. And the city council gathers together and they pass new resolutions as a city, granting Nauvoo's municipal court extended powers on habeas corpus. Now typically, a judicial body only has the authority to try habeas corpus rulings on charges based within their own jurisdiction. So for instance, the original Nauvoo charter followed this precedent by saying that the city municipal court can only have habeas corpus hearings based on people who break Nauvoo laws. But the problem is, this law was broken outside of Nauvoo and outside of Illinois. So they don't have that authority. So the city council passes a resolution that grants the Nauvoo municipal court the authority to try this case. And even more so, not to just grant a habeas corpus ruling, but to try the merits of the case. The arresting officers, you can imagine, are quite flustered by this. They're wondering what the hell just happened. And they leave the city to go talk to the governor and figure out what do we do next. And then Joseph Smith runs into hiding. Now the state acts, as you might expect, saying that these new laws that the city council passed are hogwash. They don't match our state constitution. They don't follow the law. Nauvoo responds by passing a series of more of habeas corpus laws that strengthen their authority. My favorite one being that if anyone who lives in Nauvoo is arrested while outside of Nauvoo for committing an act that breaks the law above Nauvoo and has an arrest warrant from someone issued at the state level, that person still has to be returned to Nauvoo for trial. You can't say they didn't dream big. Now, the state does not respect this. The governor at the time, Thomas Ford, says that's not how law works. But by this time, the Mormons, once again, have built a number of political friends. And their political friends say, we need to step in and help them because we want to keep the Mormon vote. And so they take them to another habeas corpus ruling, but at the proper level, at the circuit court, heard before Nathaniel Pope, and Nathaniel Pope rules in favor of Joseph Smith with his habeas corpus on the thing that the original extradition order said that Joseph Smith had committed a crime while in Nauvoo, and therefore he has to return to Nauvoo to be charged, but Joseph Smith was in Illinois at the time of Little Burn Bog's shooting, so therefore it was wrong. So that's the end of the second habeas corpus. Then the next year, Missouri sends out another requisition order for Joseph Smith. And once again, Illinois governor plays ball. And so Joseph Smith is arrested once again and is on his way to Missouri when they're intercepted by the Nauvoo Legion, who is sent out to defend their prophet. And not just the Nauvoo Legion, but a number of, once again, state politicians who want to curry favor with the Mormons. Because this is only 2 months before a big statewide election. And so they go back to Nauvoo, and once again, the Nauvoo Municipal Court grants Joseph Smith a writ of habeas corpus. Although this time, the state goes, yeah, that's fine. We're not going to challenge that city ruling. We'll just pretend you have that authority. And so if you are outside of Nauvoo, and you are worried that these Nauvooians are breaking the law, you're starting to get a bit worried. In fact, this is going to shock you. This emboldens the Mormons even more. Because one of those, what's a line? You take an inch, you get a, you might know what I'm saying. Yeah, you give them an inch, they take a mile. So even the next year, one of my favorite cases is Jeremiah Smith, a Mormon from Iowa, who gets caught. He breaks the law. There's a money order signed out for someone by his name, but not him, and he gets the money, and he flees, and he goes to Nauvoo, and he tells Joseph Smith, the authorities are after me due to anti-Mormon persecution. And Joseph Smith orders the municipal court to grant him a writ of habeas corpus. The issue was that this was before there was even an arrest warrant, which basically implies a get-out-of-jail-free card. That is the case that gets spread all across the state of Illinois. All the newspapers cover that. That basically say these Mormons are now acting above the law. And guess what? Politicians still aren't willing to step in because they don't want to lose those thousands of Mormon votes. And so when Joseph Smith is arrested after the Nauvoo expositor incident, taken to Carthage, held in jail, waiting trial, Warsaw residents are like, we've seen this movie before. We know what's going to happen. So they decide to form what they call a Committee of Safety, the same name that was used for extralegal action during the American Revolution, to signify their belief that sometimes the correct forms of justice are found outside the legal systems. And they march on Carthage jail and kill Joseph Smith. All right. Let me cover one more thing, because I'm already talking about more than I wanted, and that's polygamy. How does polygamy relate to democracy? Because another thing I noticed in researching for Nauvoo is that a lot of histories of Nauvoo, or of the spirit of the church, do one of two things. Either they're all about polygamy, focusing on polygamy, or they're all about everything else. and they hardly bring polygamy into it. But when I was looking at Nauvoo, I was amazed at how everything was interconnected. That polygamy was closely tethered to all of Joseph Smith's other actions, and it kind of casts a shadow over much of the activities in the city. Most importantly, the doctrines that develop in early Nauvoo, the ones that become keystones of the LDS faith, like temple rituals, ideals of the eternity, the eternal nature of matter, eternal unions, baptisms for the dead, all of those things are developed at the very same time that polygamy is introduced. And they're all drawn from the same idea. And in fact, this is the same anxiety that drives Smith's political actions as well, that's driving these theological revelations. That the world had lost control and order, and that priesthood authority was meant to return the structure to the world. That the voice of man had led humanity astray, and biblical patriarchs were the only solution. Just like the rule of man had become so chaotic, the traditional domestic companionate form of marriage had also introduced too much dominion, or too much anarchy. And so we need to return to some patriarchal form of stability. And that's what struck me about a lot of the, especially the women who enter into polygamy in Nauvoo. They're the through needle between all their writings later on is they emphasize the stability that polygamy offered them. And I want to highlight one more thing then about polygamy, and that's we sometimes overlook how much polygamy evolves in Nauvoo, which is kind of a weird thing to say because polygamy during Joseph Smith's life in Nauvoo is only about 3 years, so we don't think of that as a time that allows lots of change. But I was amazed at how much polygamy transforms in those few years, from one phase to another. And there are several moments that I can highlight. But I want to highlight one, because it demonstrates the role of women in how polygamy evolves. And that's Sarah Ann Whitney. Now, many of you may be aware of Sarah Ann Whitney. She was one of the teenage wives sealed to Joseph Smith. She was 17 years old, the daughter of a noble family in Nauvoo, who had been part of the church for over a decade. She had grown up revering Joseph Smith. And then in the summer of 1842, Joseph Smith proposes a sealing between them. This is one of the few documents on polygamy from the period directly associated to Joseph Smith. This revelation Joseph Smith receives to form this union between him and Sarah Ann Whitney, that Newell K. Whitney transcribes and writes down. Now, they're sealed in July of 1842. The next month, they all go visit Joseph Smith while he's in hiding during one of these extradition attempts. But what strikes out to me, as you read between the lines of a lot of these historical events and documents, is that Sarah Ann Whitney, all 17 years old of her, is still struggling to figure out what does this mean to her. A few weeks after the sealing, for instance, Joseph Smith signs over a tract of land to Sarah Ann Whitney, which was so rare for a woman to own a piece of land in Nauvoo that they had to cross out man in the printed document and write out woman. And this was, one form of, you can imagine her anxiety. If I'm secretly married to this man, how am I going to have some financial stability? And so Joseph Smith acquiesces and grants her land. But what really struck out to me was this document related to this union that comes out the next year, March 23rd, 1843. Now, this blessing document had been restricted for a long, long time. In fact, it was only put online very secretly by the Joseph Smith Papers Project without much fanfare. And in fact, Emily Jensen, who's in the back, has a great photograph of the very moment I saw this document for the first time, because I was visiting the Jensens. And Rob Jensen, who's a wonderful editor for the Joseph Smith Papers Project, brings this up, and I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? And he shows me this document, and it just blows me away. It's this document dated March 23rd, 1843, in Joseph Smith's own hand. Those are rare. And it's a blessing on Sarah Ann Whitney that reaffirms that her entire family will gain salvation due to the covenant she had entered. And while it does not directly say polygamy, it's very clearly echoing the language from the Revelation document the last summer. But then as a historian, the first question you ask when you see a document like that is, why was this created? And that takes a lot of digging. And this gets back, and I promise I'm getting back to the point of showing how this shows polygamy evolving. March 23rd, 1843. The first thing you do as a historian is you say, what's going on around that point? Well, the day before that was Sarah Ann Whitney's 18th birthday. Now, turning 18 meant a lot back then. For Sarah Ann Whitney, it meant becoming a woman. And it typically meant entering the more common marriage age. And so here's Sarah Ann Whitney, who had been secretly married the summer before, is now entering the point of courtship. And what is she supposed to say? When suitors come to her, I'm sorry, I'm not interested. That can only go on for so long. And so I imagine she's asking, what do I do? Well, there are circumstances that allow them to get around this. It just so happens that her brother-in-law, Joseph Kingsbury, who had been married to her sister, was a widower. His wife had died the previous fall in childbirth. And so on March 23rd, 1843, the same day Sarah Ann Whitney gets her blessing, Joseph Kingsbury also records a blessing that Joseph Smith gives him. And I look at this and I see, wow, this isn't just a coincidence, right? It seems like March 23rd, 1843, there is an agreement struck that, in Joseph Kingsbury's word, we're going to have a pretend marriage between Joseph Kingsbury and Sarah Ann Whitney to take her off the market. But what do we offer Joseph Kingsbury? That's a lot to ask someone who's a widower and now said, I want you to pretend like you're her husband. What does he get? Well, in this blessing, he gets the same day that Sarah Ann Whitney gets her blessing. He is promised by Joseph Smith the possibility of being sealed to his deceased spouse. This is the first instance we get of a vicarious marriage sealing. Now, you can see how there's some theological seeds already planted for that because we have vicarious baptisms by this point, and we're already having some eternal sealings. But being sealed to someone who is already dead, this was new. It was also a new way to frame polygamy, because it could theoretically give a man a chance to be sealed to both a deceased spouse and a living spouse. And that, I'm pretty sure, is the argument that finally convinces Hyrum Smith to accept polygamy. Because by that point, Hyrum Smith had been Nauvoo's most ardent opposer, critic of polygamy, unwilling to accept that Joseph Smith was practicing it. But once he saw that this was an opportunity to be sealed to his deceased Jerusha, as well as sealed to his current wife Mary Fielding, he could see the power in the doctrine, and he accepted it. And then he becomes Nauvoo's foremost polygamy defender. And I could say more about that in the Q&A if you'd like, because I think that also has some major repercussions. All right, I'm going to close because I've already gone over what how long I wanted to talk, but I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention the Council of 50. Because that's what I kind of started with, that it was a publication of the Council of 50 Minutes that got me started on this project. Now, we look at the Council of 50 Minutes, and we're like, holy cow, this is crazy. Organizing a theocratic council. I mean, they were outspoken saying, we are going to establish a theocracy because democracy had failed. We can see why the church would not want to release that during Mitt Romney's presidential run in 2012, right? But as a historian of American religion and politics at the time, what screamed out to me is, oh my gosh, this is just an extreme version of a much broader anxiety going on at the time. That there are lots of people who are wondering, is this constitution we currently have, this democratic system we currently have, is this going to last? Because America seems to be coming apart at the seams in the 1840s and 1850s over the issue of slavery, over the issues of women's suffrage, over the issue of alcohol. America seems to be falling apart. And there's a growing number of people that say the solution to this is to reinsert God and divine laws into the Constitution. Let me give you two prominent examples. John Brown, when he does his raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 to start an enslaved insurrection throughout the nation that would bring down the slave system, before he goes on his raid, he writes a provisional constitution for the new nation. And guess what that constitution bases its rights on? God's voice. Or when the Confederate States of America secede from the United States and write their own constitution, guess what the first line says? These laws are based on the laws of God. So what we see in the Council of 50, and when they write their own constitution that's based on prophetic authority, that's an extreme version, of course, yes. But it also has some symmetry with the broader cultural environment. And that's one of the things I try to highlight in this book. And I could talk more about Council of 50 and gender in the Q&A if you're interested, because that was another thing that stood out to me, that we just take it for granted that the Council of 50 was just men. And I don't think it had to be that way. All right, but I want to close kind of wrapping this together by just reading the last 2 paragraphs of this book, because I think it captures the version, the overall message of this cultural context of Nauvoo. And then I'll open up to hopefully some questions. Joseph Smith's Nauvoo vision had as much to do with democracy as anything else. And this is why Nauvoo and its failure matters. The question the Mormons posed was not just about the boundaries of religious liberty. It concerned the limits of American democracy. Today, however divided and cacophonous our political and cultural battles may be, few believe the only solution is to abandon the American experiment altogether. But the Mormons did just that, decades before Southern secession. Democracy was envisioned to manage different interests and grant individual freedoms. With the Mormons, that process broke down. After facing repeated opposition, they determined that the only way to achieve stability and assure their rights was to question traditional American principles and, when that failed to bring redress, flagrantly challenge the political and legal system. In response, both their state and federal governments proved unsympathetic to the saints' pleas, and their Gentile neighbors proved exacting in their revenge. Yet the saints were far from the first, or the last, group of dissenters to call into question traditional values in a desperate quest to realize freedom, however misbegotten, within a society driven by majority control. And even if their solutions only brought more problems, their struggles highlight real questions concerning democratic rule. So if we are to account for the full history of American democracy, we must give voice not only to its victors, but also its discontents. All right, we have some time, and I'd like to ask any burning questions you might have, as long as they're softballs.
What about the Masons?
The Masons, what about them? They flash into the scene in 1842. They are part of this much more broader movement in Nauvoo, where the Latter-day Saints, Joseph Smith especially, is trying to build relations with the broader community, trying to build up political connections. And so it is proposed to him by several people, both inside and outside Nauvoo, that Masonry is one way to do it. Because all politicians on the frontier in those days were Masons. That was a fraternal order that brought them a sense of backroom dealing and social networking. And so Joseph Smith starts a Nauvoo lodge, but once he gets into Masonry, he finds something much more than political connections. He finds what he believes a way to encounter the rituals of Abraham. Because just a few weeks before Joseph Smith is initiated into Masonry, he produces the final 2 chapters of what we now know as the Book of Abraham. He starts the Book of Abraham project in Kirtland, leaves it fallow for a few years, takes it up again in early 1842, and he translates Abraham, produces Abraham. And I argue in this book that producing those verses on Abraham transformed the Nauvoo project in important ways. Basing it around priesthood authority and Abrahamic control, to the point to where it should not surprise us, from that point on, polygamy is typically referred to as the works of Abraham. Masonry is a way to put that into practice, because one of the Masonic lore was that it's passed down from old patriarchs, including Abraham. And so he goes through these rituals, and then that, of course, connects to the endowment rituals that he introduces a few weeks later, that he uses Masonry as a vehicle to, again, present these type of Abrahamic principles of belonging. Thanks for the question. Yeah?
What new documents came forth? You've talked about that. Where'd they come from? What did they cover?
Yeah, so the major new one is the Council of 50 Minutes. And it can't be emphasized, it can't be overemphasized how significant the Council of 50 Minutes are to understanding Nauvoo, for lots of things. I worry that sometimes when the Council of 50 Minutes were released, it meant a just kind of big sigh in the community because they were looking for something much more scandalous. We were wanting to see Joseph Smith anointed a king and crowned and have a robe. I'm not quite sure. I don't follow those message boards. But what I found in the Council of 50 was people directly struggling with the political problem of democracy. One of the great things about the Council of 50 Minutes is it does not just include Joseph Smith. It includes the voices of many men in Nauvoo who are giving their opinions on their political situation. So in many ways, the Council of 50 is an unvarnished, unmatched view of the political ideas in Nauvoo. So Council of 50 Minutes is one. The other is a lot of documents that have been filtered through the Joseph Smith papers over the last few years as they've been given access to more documents, first as reference and then eventually as publication, like the Sarah Ann Whitney blessing document. There's also been a lot of Nauvoo Municipal Court records that have just been made available. The High Council records were made available. The City Council, or sorry, not all the High Council records, some of them. City Council records were all made available. And so those are, in total, a lot of those documents that had just been through the more accessible nature of the Church History Library. It makes Nauvoo much more possible to understand now. In the back.
Since you didn't think the Council of 50 had to be all men.
Yeah, okay, thank you for raising the question. I should have paid you to cue me like that. We sometimes overlook that for about 6 months in Nauvoo, the most powerful organized body included both men and women. Starting in the summer of 1843, a group that we now call the Anointed Quorum, where men and women seal together, gather together to do their prayer circles and do their rituals together. But they also talk about the city. They're organizing Joseph Smith's presidential run. They're trying to figure out the response to the state political issues. They're organized, and women's voices are included in that. And part of this is kind of this Faustian bargain of women accepting polygamy and granting this patriarchal power through both these temple rituals, but also a say in political matters. So what changes? Because there seems to be a trajectory going on here. Well, in March 1844, Emma Smith once again takes a public opposition to polygamy. Rumor starts spreading again. I'm pretty sure something happens between Joseph Smith and Emma again, and their peace that they brokered the previous fall kind of falls apart. And Emma Smith holds a series of 4 public meetings in Nauvoo denouncing polygamy, using the most direct language she has ever used in public, saying things like, trust what Joseph Smith says from the stand, not what he says in private. You don't have to be an expert to read between the lines there. She says that a group of several thousand women in Nauvoo, and even publishes a pamphlet called Virtue Will Prevail that denounces polygamy and says, we believe in traditional marital values. That same week, Emma Smith is holding those meetings. The Council of 50 is organized. And guess what? One of the things that men have to do to be initiated in the practice, they have to swear that they will not reveal what goes on, even to their wives. And so there seemed to be one particular tradition, who knows where it would have gone, but the circumstances changed by March 1844. And we get much of a different thing. And what I find interesting is that kind of lays the groundwork for Brigham Young when he takes over just that fall. That kind of takes things in a different direction. Thanks. Yeah?
It's my understanding in the Council of 50 Minutes, there's quite a bit of discussion about moving somewhere, Texas or wherever, Utah.
Yeah.
How much of that was part of the time when Joseph Smith was part of it, as opposed to when Brigham Young was part of it?
So they start talking about potential other settlements is the reason the Council of 50 was first organized. They get reports that from the pioneer missionaries that we can go down to Texas and form a cross-indigenous American empire down in Texas. Joseph Smith is interested, but he always wants to maintain a headquarters in Nauvoo. It was kind of like, if everything else fails, we might have something elsewhere. One of my favorite parts of their potential discussions of moving to Texas is as they're writing down these documents in Joseph Smith's journal, they write down, go to Texas. And they almost have this moment of pause. They're like, oh my gosh, what if someone gets a hold of these journals and finds out we're considering Texas? So they cross out Texas and they write in Saxit. A few of you have caught it already. Saxit is just Texas backwards. And they're like, nailed it. And they even start a private conversation, a secret correspondence with Sam Houston, which of course I think is cool. It doesn't go anywhere, and by the time the next year, when they're really determined to find settlements elsewhere, Texas is no longer an option because Texas has just been annexed by America. Now, why was Texas anxious for the Mormons to come down? Because they get lots of people. Well, the former mayor of Galveston, Texas, which was back then the largest city down there, promises Joseph Smith 100 acres of land in what is now present-day Nacogdoches, East Texas, and says, you will have the numbers to basically control the Texas Republic government. He knows how to flatter Joseph Smith. Why would they want that at the same moment that Illinois people want to get the Mormons out of there? Well, it's practical reasons. At that point, Texas had been appealing to be annexed by the United States for a long time, and the United States was hesitating due to internal politics, especially over slavery. So the Texans are worried that we're never going to be annexed by America, which leaves us vulnerable to the Mexican army. At any moment, the Mexican army march up and take over the Texas Republic again. And so they look at Nauvoo and the Nauvoo Legion, the same militia that terrifies Illinois residents, and they're like, we need those men to protect us. But of course that falls apart, and neither side are interested in the next year. The Council of 50 becomes the center point for discussion of Western settlement in 1845. One of the things that the Council of 50 Minutes revealed that we didn't know before was how detailed these discussions were early on, including how early they were thinking about the Salt Lake Basin for settlement. What was difficult, though, is they were discussing all these settlement options in the secret council, while everyone else in Illinois thinks that the Mormons are digging in their heels, and so that leads to more conflict. So, yeah, good question. Others? Yeah?
How does Helen Mar Kimball Whitney fit in with Sarah?
Yeah.
And is Sarah, how is she related to Horace?
Yeah.
Talking the same?
Yeah, so Horace is Sarah Kimball's brother. And in fact, early on, the Whitneys are explicitly told not to tell Horace about this, because they know he's going to not look kindly on his little sister being sealed to Joseph Smith. And I think that's actually one of the anxieties behind the promise that the whole family will be sealed together as a result of that sealing. Even Horace, if he rejects it, he's still going to be pulled in by the grand tentacles of Providence into the eternal family. Helen Mar Kimball is a friend of Sarah and Whitney. They're of the same age, they're 17. The way I really appreciate Helen Mar Kimball is that Sarah Ann Whitney never says much about her sealing to Joseph Smith. Helen Mar Kimball does. And so I think we have the contemporary documents of Sarah Ann Whitney, and we have the later reminiscences, the theological musings of Helen Mar Kimball. And between those two, I think we can do more to flesh out the experience of especially these young brides of Joseph Smith. Thanks.
Then he's sealed to
yeah, and Joseph Smith is sealed to Helen Mar Kimball the next summer.
and she marries Horace.
Right, yeah, so they're all connected, and also it's important to note that Helen Mar Kimball is another one of Joseph Smith's young wives who is given a plot of land in Nauvoo. So we almost see kind of a systematic pattern here. These young wives sealed to Joseph Smith. What are they going to do long-term financial-wise? Well, we can at least give them the plot of land. Yep?
How early and how involved was Joseph Smith in the decision to abandon Nauvoo and move into the Rocky Mountains?
Yeah, how involved was Joseph Smith about fleeing Nauvoo and moving to the Rocky Mountains? As I mentioned earlier, he did not want to leave Nauvoo. Even when they were discussing moving to Texas or moving to the West, California, he was just thinking, we're going to have satellite operations, and Nauvoo's still going to remain the hub. He also never really thinks about the Great Salt Lake. All the accounts of Joseph Smith prophesying the saints going to the Great Salt Lake Valley are later reminiscences that I think are placed on Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith is mostly thinking either Texas or California. Those are the regions he's thinking about. But again, he wants to stay in Nauvoo. Moving is a last-ditch option for him. Yep?
Why the run for the presidency?
Why the run for the presidency? Why not, I think, is what most politicians say nowadays. In the fall of 1843, the saints are they're burning all their bridges with state authorities. Things are looking very dark in Illinois, mostly due to this big election in August 1843. I had mentioned the Habeas Corpus issue in July 1843. One of the reasons the politicians were eager to help Joseph Smith is there was this important election coming up. One of the politicians who helped get Joseph Smith free was a Whig by the name of Cyrus Walker. And Cyrus Walker comes away from this episode convinced that he has the Mormon vote. Because he was able to help free Joseph Smith, the Mormons are going to vote him into office as a congressman that August. The problem was the Democratic candidate, Joseph Hogue, was also anxious to get the Mormon vote. So he meets with the Mormons and says, not only do I support all of your habeas corpus stuff, but I also think that we need to strengthen Nauvoo's chartered powers. And so Nauvooians are like, yeah, this is great, but this leaves Joseph Smith in a dilemma. Joseph's like, I personally promised my vote to Cyrus Walker, but we think the Democrats are going to do more to support our interests. So they do this kind of dance of the election in August of 1843, where Joseph Smith gets up and says, I'm personally voting for Cyrus Walker. Hiram Smith gets up and says, I've had a revelation that the saints should vote for Joseph Hogue. And Hiram Smith says, I haven't had a revelation about my vote, but I'll tell you this, I've never known Hiram to have a revelation and it turn out to be wrong. And so you can tell how this angers the Whig Party. It also terrifies the Democratic Party because they realize, and you have some some Democratic politicians who are saying, yeah, they voted on our side, this side, but we can tell from this episode that we can't really trust the Mormon process anymore. So both political parties that fall are no longer willing to work with the Mormons. So Joseph Smith and others say, if we can't rely on state authorities, we need to look nationally. We need to look to the federal government. So they sent a series of petitions that fall, including asking Congress to designate Nauvoo a federal territory, kind of like a reservation that's going to be outside of state control and only controlled by Congress, using this argument that whenever a majority in a state is going to oppress those within the state, the federal government should intercede. This was a novel concept during this time. The only other people who are making that argument are abolitionists, anti-slavery people who are saying that these slave-holding states, the federal government needs to intercede. And that idea of the federal government assuring the rights of individuals does not become the rule of law until the Reconstruction Amendments in the 1860s and 1870s. So Joseph Smith and the Saints, they start appealing to the federal government, not just for redress, but protection. There's a key difference between those two things. And they start writing the presidential candidates who are expected to run for the presidency the next year. 1844, big presidential election year because there was no sure front runner. So they write letters to the 5 potential candidates. 3 of them respond. None of them give promises to support the Saints. And they are desperate by this point. And so they decide, well, if they're not going to respect our interests, we need to elect one of our own, and they nominate Joseph Smith. And I'm not convinced Joseph Smith thought that it was a viable thing, but I see it more as a protest candidate. But they put a lot of effort into it. They were organizing state conventions throughout all the states in America to nominate Joseph Smith. They sent out several hundred electioneering missionaries. They flooded America with Joseph Smith's presidential platform, which was a very interesting platform that strengthened the federal government, gave a gradual emancipation scheme to end slavery, increased sailors' rights, because why not? Tried to establish a national bank. Just a fascinating set of documents. So those are the main anxieties behind his run for president. Yeah?
There were some non-members in the Council of 50.
Yeah.
Were they significant, or how did they get there? What role did they play?
So, when Joseph Smith establishes the Council of 50, he very specifically says we need non-Mormons on the council, and they appoint 3. And Joseph Smith even says there should always be members, people who are not members of the faith as part of this political body. Because while there is a big discussion in the Council of 50, and this is one of the great things about the Council of 50 Minutes, is it has a variety of opinions. Not everyone agreed. While some were saying that the kingdom and the church were one and the same, Joseph Smith said no. This council, this theocratic government, is separate from the church. I know that's kind of hard for us to wrap our heads around because the same person is in charge of both. But in his mind, we want the kingdom to be separate from the ecclesiastical system. What's important or interesting is after Joseph Smith dies and Brigham Young takes control of the Council of 50 the next year, the first thing he does is do a motion to drop the 3 Gentiles from the council. Because at the same debate in 1844, when Joseph Smith is saying that these 2 things are not the same, the kingdom and the church, and we need Gentile representation, Brigham Young is saying, I see no difference between these 2 things. God's kingdom and God's church are the same. And then Brigham Young institutes that after Joseph Smith's death. So I would say Joseph Smith's vision, it might have been just a rhetorical thing because these 3 Gentiles never say much. I sometimes wonder what the hell they were thinking in those meetings. But sadly, we don't have their perspectives. How long are we supposed to go?
Anytime, let's take a couple more.
All right, let's take a couple more questions. Janelle.
Where does the Relief Society fit into the kingdom?
Yes.
Ecclesiastical or civic, or does it?
Yes. The Relief Society, we know the Relief Society is important. But what I found so interesting was that the Relief Society was so integrated in Nauvoo's broader societal cleansing mission. Because it's important to note that when the women get together and propose the Relief Society, they originally envisioned it as a way to help the poor, provide clothing for those working on the temple. And Joseph Smith says, no, I want this society to be something more. You are to be the moral police force. You are to cleanse the city from sin. And the women run with this. And what I find fascinating, I'm using that phrase a lot, I apologize. But what I found lots of things fascinating. What I find fascinating about this is from the very beginning of the Relief Society, you get a division over what they viewed the Relief Society to be between Joseph Smith and the women. Because once Joseph Smith proposes that the Relief Society is going to be more than just a relief effort, the women are like, yeah, that sounds great, and they run with it. And Joseph Smith, from the very earliest meetings, are like, whoa, 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 slow down. Because I get the picture that Joseph Smith wanted the Relief Society to kind of defend his vision, defend his character, defend his honor, and stay within the confines of his societal vision. But Emma Smith takes the reins. She's a strong, independent woman, and she believes that the Relief Society has this grand purpose. And so you get Joseph and Emma arguing with each other in front of the Relief Society. And the Relief Society, as Joseph Smith grants them this authority to cleanse society, they take it, and I think later on he regrets it. Because you get one point in March of 1844, after Emma Smith holds these series of meetings, Joseph said, I never had any problems with these polygamy rumors until the women got up in arms about it. And then Brigham Young the next year says in one of these Brigham Young quotes that he goes, what's a Relief Society good for? Nothing but to relieve us of our best brethren. And so you see these women, they're very much part of Joseph Smith's vision. But they take it in their own hands, and they run with it. And that causes one of these central tensions throughout Nauvoo. All right, maybe we'll have time for one more question. Go for it.
Could that have been an extension of the battle between Joseph and Emma?
Oh, very much so. Yeah. The Relief Society meetings kind of provide the arena, especially during the John C. Bennett scandal that breaks out in the summer of 1842, when Joseph Smith is worried that John C. Bennett, who is the city's mayor, gets caught having liaisons who, what he defends are polygamous marriages just like Joseph Smith. And Joseph Smith wants to be careful with the investigation because he's worried any deep investigation into John C. Bennett is going to reveal his polygamous project. And so he tries to tamp down on the investigation. But Emma Smith goes, no, you assigned us to police this city. And there is at one point a big public fight in the Relief Society where Joseph Smith is saying, women, you need to be kinder in your relation to the brethren. Prompt them to good works. Don't call out their wickedness. And Emma Smith says, no, there is no, wickedness cannot be overlooked. This is our job. So yeah. All right, thank you so much for these great questions. This was great. Have a good day.